Hi everyone, welcome back to Pages of the Globe. Today I'm going to be reading to you the short story Butterfly Dreams by Donald Jacob Uitvlugt. Now, before we start, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about the author, and then we're going to jump straight into the story. So, Donald Jacob Uitvlugt lives on the nether coast of the United States, but mostly in a haunted memory palace of his own design. While his preferred genre is fantasy, he also writes horror and science fiction and loves stories that stretch, cross, and/or break genre lines. His short fiction has appeared in a number of print and online venues, including Cover of Darkness, The Journey of Unlikely Entomology, and the Willie Writers podcast, as well as the anthology Sparks, Wolf Songs 2, and New Surrey Rising Stories for Japan. He also regularly serves as a judge at the weekly one-on-one writing competition at thewritersarena.com. He strives to write what he calls haiku fiction, stories small in scope but big in impact. The specific short story I will be reading, Butterfly Dreams, was originally published in Cross Genres in 2010, and I found it specifically in the Gothic fantasy series Science Fiction Short Stories. Before I continue, I do want to talk about the Gothic fantasy series itself. I use this book so many times, or the series so many times, because I literally love the short stories in it, but oftentimes they will not be super famous, so I'm not going to be able to find a proper analysis of them online. So I'll really just be giving what I thought about the book, what I had about the analysis. So what I did in Clockwork Evangeline, if you watch that by Nema Wolfen or something like that, I will just be kind of giving you my own opinion on the book, what I thought it was about, or the short story, sorry. And yeah, but I do recommend that you guys find a few of these books from the Gothic fantasy series, whether it's science fiction short stories, horror short stories, short stories by Black authors. It's just such a good series to find good short stories from that you can kind of enjoy on your own time, because I do like to read stories that are maybe a little bit more famous or popular that people would know or people would have heard of. But these short stories are so interesting, especially Butterfly Dreams. When I first read it, I was like, let me read this again because I have no idea what's going on. So yeah, it's a really interesting novel or short story, and I think you guys will be pretty impressed. Without further ado, let's get on with the story. Remember to like, share, subscribe, and comment down below which short story you'd like to hear next. Butterfly Dreams by Donald Jacob Uitvlugt. It was finished. Doug Kane pulled the door of his brother's home behind him, making sure that the lock caught. He slid behind the wheel of his black Mustang and backed it down the driveway. He waited until he could work his way out of Russell's development and then hit the gas. His Mustang was a conspicuous car, but he needed speed more than stealth. He hoped to be 2 states away by the time the police found his brother Russell's body. Doug pulled out onto the highway and clicked on the radio. Perhaps that would distract him from his swirling thoughts. We'd like to take a moment to thank our day sponsor, SoshiTech. SoshiTech, for all your... Doug mentally tuned out the commercial and the station identification. He had finally caught a break. The highway should have been bumper to bumper this early in the morning, but while the flow of traffic around him was steady, there were enough gaps that Doug could weave through them without ever having to drop below 90. Something about moving around the cars evoked a strong feeling of déjà vu. Doug shook his head. If only Russell hadn't started hitting Kathy, none of this would have happened. Doug gripped the steering wheel, trying hard not to think about the way his brother had looked up at him with those unseeing eyes. He tried not to think about how Russell's marriage to the kindest and prettiest woman in the world had started to unravel before the couple had returned from their honeymoon. The attacks had been verbal at first, Doug only hearing about them after the fact. But the night Kathy showed up on his front porch in tears with a black eye, he turned up the volume of the radio. Don't think about it. Concentrate on getting out of town. His mind would go round in circles if he let it. Was Del Shannon's runaway? Doug found himself hating that perfect radio voice. And now, here's Johann Sebastian Bach's Toccata and Fugue in D minor. Doug blinked as the melancholy strains of organ came through the Mustang's speaker. Eclectic mix. I didn't know that there were any independent stations left in town. I thought they'd all been bought up by the big conglomerates, and it was all of that pre-programmed He slammed on the brakes, only just avoiding the golden retriever that darted in front of the Mustang. What the hell is that dog doing on the highway? A quick glance around told Doug that it wasn't the dog that was out of place. He wasn't on the highway anymore. Somehow he had wound up back in the suburbs, not at all sure how he had gotten there. That set finished up with Slip Sliding Away by Paul Simon. Next up, The Monkees with Pleasant Valley Sunday. Doug ignored the background buzz of the radio, trying to figure out where exactly he was. God, I'm in Russell's development. How the hell did I get back here? Guilt? Or perhaps his subconscious mind was trying to help him out? Maybe he had left something at the scene. Should he check? He idled at a red light, deciding which way to turn. He saw someone out of the corner of his eye. Her face, she looked so much like Kathy, only without the black eye and bruises she had sported last time Doug had seen her. There was something else. The only thing Doug could compare it was to the feeling he sometimes got in the department stores when he caught sight of a person out of the corner of his eye, even felt a presence behind him, but when he turned it was only a mannequin. This was that same feeling, only in reverse, like the woman had been less real until Doug had looked at her, some unseen force popping Kathy's face into place at the last minute. He shook his head, even though the light had turned green. Was the fact he was seeing Kathy and strangers another omen? I don't have time to worry about this. Stick to the plan. Get the heck out of Dodge. He turned left, away from his brother's house, leaving Russell's body behind him. He drove past a park, moving slower than he would have liked, trying to get back to the highway. A number of children were playing there, which was odd for a school day morning. Doug's stomach churned as he watched the children. He could almost see their faces snapping into place as he looked at them. Just as before, it was like they were somehow less real until he looked at them directly. Nerves. It had to be nerves. Doug hadn't been as cold-blooded about killing his brother as he thought he had been. The deed was catching up with him. Proud Mary by Ike and Tina Turner. Talk about your explosive relationships. And with that, we move on to Judas Priest with You Got Another Thing Coming. Doug forced himself to drive past the park. As he rounded the block, he saw a kid leaning up against a fence watching him. Bobby? Bobby Reynolds? It couldn't be. Bobby had taken his own life when he and Doug were both in the 8th grade. He'd always felt guilty about not doing something to prevent Bobby's death. His guilt had to be taking over. He was seeing things. Whoever the child really was, he seemed to recognize Doug, waving to him as he drove past. Doug forced himself to look away, gripping the wheel tightly. Another blast from the past with the theme from MASH, and a special note to those of you in the western suburbs. Police have just discovered the body of prominent local physician Russell Kane. The doctor was found murdered in his own home. The suspect or suspects are believed to still be in the area. So lock your doors, kiddies, leave your lights on, and stay with us. Next up, Soft Cell with Tainted Love. Doug fought down his panic. How had they discovered Russell's body so fast? His brother was supposed to be out of town for the next week. Everybody at the hospital and the club knew this, and Kathy and the kids were away at her mother's. It had been the perfect time to try and stop Russell from ever hurting Kathy again. And now his carefully made plan was all falling to hell. He nosed the Mustang towards the highway again, trying to move as fast as he could without drawing unwanted attention to his car. He could hardly breathe. In the distance, he heard the sound of sirens. Flight instinct set in. Doug floored it, turning the wheel. Downtown? How had he wound up downtown? The sirens grew louder, and Doug could see the squad cars. This was going to be his last chance. And I'm out of here. I leave you with Mozart's Dies Irae. As Doug rounded a corner, a police car teed into him and another rear-ended him. His windshield cracked, red paint blossoming like fireworks in the night sky. As he died, the last few hours flashed before his eyes. Kathy, his careful planning, his confrontation with his brother, the murder. It was finished. Doug Kane pulled the door of his brother's home behind him, making sure that the lock caught. He slipped behind the wheel of his red Firebird and backed it down the highway. He waited until he could work his way out of Russell's development and then hit the gas. His Mustang was a conspicuous car, but he needed speed more than stealth. He hoped to be 2 states away by the time the police found his brother Russell's body. Doug pulled onto the highway and clicked on the radio. We'd like to take a moment to thank our daily sponsor, Sochi Tech. Sochi Tech, the highway should have been bumper to bumper this early morning, but there were enough gaps that Doug could weave through them without ever having to drop below 90. Something about moving around the cars evoked a strong feeling of déjà vu. Russell shook his head. If only Russell hadn't started hitting Kathy, none of this would have happened. Russell Kane smiled, looking down from the view screen to his brother in the VR machine. Doug's body was immobilized by a web of wires, straps, with goggles over his eyes thicker than a blind man's sunglasses. A breathing mask and feeding tube blotted out the rest of his brother's face. It wasn't going to be a pretty life for Doug, trapped in that loop, reliving forever a death that never happened. At least it's better than what you had planned for me, Dougie. A marvelously full-service place this. What do their ads say? Sochi Tech for all your virtual reality needs. They've gone above and beyond here. Still, no need for them to know that. They might charge him more, citing God only knew what clause in the 50-page contract. He tried his best to hide his smile of triumph, succeeding poorly. You want to see the loop again? Russell turned to see the moon-faced technician in his white lab coat. The man had one of those nondescript faces that you could swore you would have seen before, but just couldn't remember where. Just one more time. You approved the script yourself, Dr. Kane. I can assure you that the scene loops with only slight changes in scenery and casting, drawing from the subject's own memories. We find that the variation keeps the subject from ever figuring out he's in a VR environment. Your brother will experience that car crash ad infinitum, especially given what you're paying us. I did not pay for that commercial for your blasted company. Policy, I'm afraid. I was able to place the advertisement as close to the beginning of the loop as possible, where the subject will be most disoriented. A sudden thought occurred to Russell, triggered from a news report he had read once upon a time. And if he figures out that the commercial repeats, he could wake himself from the cycle. In the long history of this firm, we have never had a subject awake due to an autosuggestion. Consider, too, that he would remember our name from the ad. If your brother were to awake, I doubt that things would go well for us. An overzealous DA might even interpret our actions on behalf of yours as a criminal. And leaving the law to one side, we've seen your brother's violent tendencies. In fact, our lab studied them in depth to create that environment. Trust me, Dr. Kane, your brother will remain in VR until you choose to release him or he dies of natural causes. Russell had to admit that the technician had answered all his questions. His gloating smile returned as he turned back to his brother. He watched the view screen for a moment, enjoying the growing desperation playing out there. Then he looked down on Doug's real body, trapped in the VR machine, his face obscured by the goggles, breathing mask, and feeding tube. What was that slogan? Sochi Tech for all your virtual reality needs. It was not going to be a pretty life for Doug at all, but it was better than he deserved. Do you want to see the loop again? Russell turned towards the technician, a hint of smile on his lips. Just one more time. And you're certain he feels no pain? Not at all, Mr. Kane. The technician seemed to sense Doug's hesitation and went on. Your brother is a sick man, Mr. Kane. It's clear from your own research that not only was he abusing his wife, he was going to have you institutionalized in this facility. Illegally, I might add. That's why we contacted you. Yes, but to do to him what he was going to me, it doesn't seem right. The technician paused before speaking. Remember, it's an illness that we are speaking of here, Mr. Kane, and a serious one at that. We still don't understand this sort of compulsions that drive someone to try and act in such antisocial ways, but psychiatric science is making new advances all the time. Perhaps one day your brother can be cured of his rage and jealousy, but until then it's safer for everyone for him to be here, including Dr. Kane. Doug looked down at Russell. Behind the grotesque goggles and mask, his brother was smiling. He couldn't remember the last time Russell had smiled. Doug wondered what he saw. "Okay, where are the papers?" "Right this way, Mr. Kane, and thank you for choosing Soci Tech for all your virtual reality needs." Doug froze, a chill running down his spine. From somewhere, he heard the sound of a woman laughing. All right, so that was Butterfly Dreams by Donald Jacob Uitvlugt. Before we start the analysis and all of that, I'm just going to give you like a quick overview, a quick summary of the story, as I always do, and then we'll jump straight into it. So this short story, obviously, it's kind of hard to follow along with sometimes, but in the beginning, we see Doug Kane, from one of the Kane brothers, and he's basically driving. He's trying to get away because he just killed his brother, who was abusing his wife. And he's trying to get out of, like, the suburbs. He's trying to get, like, straight, and he's hoping to be 2 states away by the time the police find his body. But he keeps somehow ending up in the same area. Like, he keeps ending up in the same, like his brother's development, and he keeps thinking, oh my god, this is definitely because of, like, my guilt or whatever. But sooner or later, like, as we continue reading, we realize, like, the same things are constantly happening. He's, like, coming out in traffic, and it's, like, really crowded, but somehow he's able to weave through all the cars. And we just kind of at one point obviously noticed that everything is being repeated. So automatically the reader's like, what's going on? Then we jump to another basically scene where we find that Doug Kane's brother, Russell Kane, who he had just supposedly killed, is actually setting his brother up to some like VR screen. And he's like basically fooling his brother into thinking he just killed himself, and now he's driving away from the scene. And like at the very end, Doug is caught by the police, and he's like dies, and it's just very traumatic for him. And so for Russell, he's like happy because he's basically seeing his brother relive this over and over again. But as we read, we notice that yet again, Russell's scene has repeated. And at first, I didn't notice this because it's like the guy just asks, oh, would you like to do this again? And he's like, yeah, sure. But suddenly you automatically realize, okay, now Russell's like scene is repeating again. And then at the end, we see Doug come in, and he's viewing Russell view him killing his brother. And Doug is like automatically like, he's like feels bad, but obviously what he's doing to Russell is way better than what Russell was doing to Doug, right? And at the very end, Doug hears this commercial. Thank you for choosing Soci Tech for all your virtual reality needs. And Doug immediately was like, okay, hold up. Because it is company policy to include that specific commercial in every single virtual thing. So they try to keep it at the beginning of every single loop, but obviously it's going to like keep coming up. And in the background, he hears the sound of a woman laughing. Now, the reader could probably assume that woman is specifically Kathy, Russell's wife, and I'm just going to go ahead and assume that this is like her revenge on both of them. Automatically, as we're reading through Doug's story, we kind of see that he maybe has some sort of interest in Kathy, whether it's romantic or just like a brotherly kind of relationship, but he definitely has an interesting relationship with her. We also know that Russell hurts his wife and he abuses her, and we know that Kathy probably has ill feelings towards him. Now, something that I found really interesting was how like each scene would repeat, and then the reader would automatically be thrown off. Like, these scenes kept on repeating. And honestly, for the longest time, I didn't even realize they were repeating until we jumped into the next paragraph. And I was like, oh my god. And what I found interesting was, one of the things that I noticed at least, was when, in the very first scene, when it opens up, and Doug is like, oh, like I had a sense of deja vu. I literally had a sense of deja vu as I read like that scene repeating, and I was like, didn't I just read this? Whatever. And I just continued on. I was like, oh my God, this literally repeated. And I had the same thing when I was reading the next scene with Russell. This was such an interesting story to me. I read this last summer, and that was when I kind of wanted to release it out to y'all, but I didn't end up getting around to it. But this was so interesting to me, and I loved how in the very end, like, it's kind of hinted that Kathy is the one controlling them, because I feel like that was just such a surprising and twist ending. And I really did love that specific part, and it was like, obviously Doug has his, and like each scene, the person is being like slightly tortured. Like in Doug's scene, he's obviously being tortured because he's like, he has this whole like guilt about killing his brother, and then he's like getting caught by the police. And then in Russell's, honestly, I didn't see too much torture, but there is like probably some kind of guilt about doing this to his brother. And then in the next scene, we see this very obviously with Doug, where he's feeling incredibly guilty about what he's doing to Russell. So like in each scene, they are like torturing themselves almost, but at the same time, they were planning on killing or doing something harmful to the other person. Like, no matter what Doug did, Doug killed his brother. No matter what Russell felt, Russell was fooling his brother. No matter what guilt Doug felt, he was fooling his brother. So all of them have like some sort of guilt or torture happening, but at the same time, they were planning on doing that to the person next to them. Like Russell was abusing his wife. So I just found this was such an interesting twist, especially at the very end when like the women, like you can hear the woman laughing, you can automatically assume it's Kathy. And I just love that little twist, and I really want to share this story with you guys. So yeah, that's about it for today. Remember to like, share, subscribe, and comment down below which short story you'd like to hear next.